Good morning and a warm welcome to everyone who's joined the webinar. I can see there are still some people joining in, and my apologies for the slight confusion in the and the delay in starting the webinar. We were not sure whether we had announced at 7 o'clock or at 7:30, which is 3 o'clock or 3:30 UK time webinar, and clearly we had we sort of made a mistake there. Again, my apologies, but we are ready to start. Mike is here with me, and we can go ahead and get going here. Let me go ahead and get started with some initial housekeeping and the introduction to the webinar itself, and we'll go from there. So the webinar is today on the subject of Scrum and Kanban Revisited. Really a hugely popular and topic that is of resonance to a lot of you. We had probably one of the largest response to the webinars in terms of the number of people who have registered. So I hope that we justify your interest and hopefully answer all your questions here. The webinar is brought to you by Agenda Shift, which is Mike's company, and Swift Kanban from Digite. Let me just go ahead and get started. The agenda, of course, is straightforward. We'll start with some introductions. I'll give you a quick overview of Digite Swift Kanban, and then, of course, I'll hand over the session to Mike. And after his session, hopefully, we'll have a good, spirited discussion with some good Q&A after that. The webinar is being recorded, and we will provide the slides in the recording to you after the webinar in a follow-up email. And we will take questions via the Q&A box that you should see on your screens on the right side on the GoToWebinar panel. Feel free to ask a question anytime, and we will take those questions up at the end of the session by Mike. So with that, let me do the introductions. For those of you who may not know Mike, Mike is the founder of Agenda Shift, which is a consulting organization. Mike is based out of UK. My name is Mahesh Singh. I'm Senior Vice President for Marketing at Digite, which is the publisher of a number of tools, including Swift Kanban. Mike, of course, like I said, is the founder of Agenda Shift, which facilitates experiment-based evolution of process, practice, and organization. He's the author of the book Agenda Shift and the very famous book in the Kanban community, Kanban from the Inside. He's the creator of concepts such as Feature Ban, Change Ban, and others. And of course, he's a very well-respected, well-known consultant, coach, trainer, and an international speaker. I've had the pleasure to listen to him in many conferences, including several that we hosted ourselves, especially in India. And he's, of course, the winner of the Brickell Award, which is handed by the Lean Kanban University. Above all, I've known Mike now since probably 2010 or 11. And I think he's just a wonderful human being. Some of the things that he and his family do, on the social side is just been amazing. And I let Mike talk about it himself or not, depending on how much time we have. But like I said, he's just a fantastic person, and I'm really honored to know him myself. Before I hand over the mic to Mike, let me just quickly introduce Digite to those of you who may not know us very much. We have been based in the Bay Area here in San Francisco. Our head office in Cupertino, California. We provide a variety of web-based collaborative tools for geographically distributed teams for doing Agile and Kanban and project management. And we have quite a large user base based all over the world. And of course, Swift Kanban is our sort of flagship Lean Kanban product. We've got a couple of other products which are in the Agile ALM space. And last year we launched a product for the scaled Agile community, and that follows the SAFe framework. And any of you who are curious about this, we'd love to hear from you. Just a quick introduction to Swift Kanban, which has been sort of our main Agile Scrum Kanban tool. it's probably used the most by IT and software communities. Probably 60 to 70% of our customers use it for software development or IT, and quite a number of those use the Kanban product for doing Scrum and Scrumban, and it is always interesting to see how they sort of combine the two and what are some of the best practices that come out of it. But of course, Kanban is also a general business tool that is used by a variety of other non-tech functions as well. For example, marketing, HR, legal, just a range of them. Manufacturing is another, and we actually provide a number of templates out of the box in the tool that help with doing these other non-tech functions as well using the Kanban board. And of course, a large number of our users are also personal Kanban users, and we have some templates out of the box that let you work with personal Kanban, getting things done, those types of concepts. If you use that for your personal organization, you can use the tool for your personal productivity as well. We are very well known for our analytics capabilities. Just an additional slide here to let you know why some of our customers like us. And one of the things that a lot of people use Kanban for is really to look at how they can improve further based on whatever they might be doing, whether it is Scrum or iterative or waterfall or other methods. We provide a range of analytics that give you an idea of how you could improve based on what you're doing currently and what you do once you start to use Kanban as a method to improve your existing processes. A lot of insight based on that. And of course, we have a range of customers around the world that use our products. So I'll go ahead and finish off with that. Mike, a very warm welcome to you. And again, my apologies for the confusion in the start time of the webinar, but hopefully you got your cup of tea and you can get going on the webinar today. And I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter while you can start talking.
Thank you, Mahesh, and thank you very much for that kind welcome. And as you said, I do have my cup of tea in hand. If you hear a pause or slurping, I'd like it to be my tea. I'm just going to share my screen. Mahesh, is that visible?
Not yet, Mike.
Okay, it should be coming.
Yep, I can see it now. We are on the your contact information slide.
Great, good. Okay, well, let's get started. I suppose I should start. I will introduce myself again in a moment, but I'll just start with some expectations first. This isn't going to be a deeply technical talk. This is much more about the really the philosophy behind Scrum and Kanban, or some of the philosophy behind Scrum and Kanban, and we can seriously ask ourselves, draw our own conclusions as to how compatible they are, how they might work together or not. But I'll say from my side, I hope that all of you will consider this, respectful to both frameworks. I certainly have a deep respect for both. I did describe Scrum in my first book, Kanban from the Inside. I made a conscious effort at the time I wrote that to be as positive as I possibly could about Scrum. Hopefully that didn't sound grudging. I would say in the time since publishing that book, which was in 2014, my regard for Scrum has only grown, and we'll see later in the talk. I'll make reference to some projects that I've worked on that have used Scrum to very good effect. So I hope you'll feel that this is interesting, but also fair to both sides, perhaps challenging to some as well, and I hope that we can have a discussion at the end. The style will be a little bit feisty, perhaps. The history to this is I wrote a blog post a few months ago. I think it was my most popular blog post of last year. The history to that blog post I will explain in a moment, but it certainly was certainly punchy. It started out as a rant, and then I edited it to something that wasn't quite so ranty. But that's how it started. A bit about myself. So as Mahesh has already mentioned, I am the author of the 2014 book Kanban from the Inside. This is the book really that launched a values-based treatment of Kanban that when I first started blogging about it in 2013 seemed quite radical. Very different from the very tool-centric treatments of Kanban that were prevailing at the time. But I'm very gratified to say that it's pretty mainstream now. I mean, people are very happy talking about Kanban in terms of values like transparency, balance, and collaboration, and so on. And they've been formally adopted as part of the method now. Agenda shift, which is what I've been working on since after the book, really. The book was in a way a springboard for agenda shift, but agenda shift isn't itself in any way dependent on Kanban. It's not just for people that use Kanban. It's being tested even from its earliest days by Scrum coaches and Scrum teams. You'll see some of our corporate partners listed at the bottom of the slide here. There's a mixture of people that you might recognize from the Kanban world, but others that have Scrum even in the company name. Certainly people with, from the mainstream Agile world, and some names from industry as well. We're being used by, by organizations, managers, internal coaches and so on, and not just by people that sell themselves as practitioners. What sets us apart is this idea of outcome-oriented change and continuous transformation, and we'll perhaps you'll get a little flavour of what some of that is about by the end of the talk. So some background, and I must start with some acknowledgements. The history to the blog post was that I was tagged in LinkedIn by someone who was preparing to join this webinar given by Steve Porter and Daniel Vicanti, both of whom I know. I actually didn't twig straight away that it was their webinar that was the source of the LinkedIn post. I just saw some stuff I wanted to respond to. I actually ordinarily wouldn't have responded to it. I kind of thought that the whole Scrum versus Kanban debate was something that was, we kind of put behind us several years ago. I think in the blog I said, oh, was it 2012 again? But there was a line in the post that actually did catch my attention, and it was the idea that Scrum and Kanban will enhance the collaboration across your Agile teams. And why that caught my eye is because of what I'm working on, agenda shift. Here's our true north statement. Everyone able to work consistently at their best, individuals, teams, between teams, across the organisation and beyond. Right conversations, right people, best possible moment. Needs anticipated, met at just the right time. In this line here, enhance the collaboration across your Agile teams, that clearly resonated with that first bullet point, individuals, teams, between teams, across the organisation and beyond. My interest now isn't just in coaching teams how to be a little bit more efficient. I really am working with organisations to help them agree on what outcomes they want to achieve, help them bring some of the contradictions in their organisations to the surface and help them resolve them and so on. And I no longer see this as just a team-centric challenge. In fact, focusing just on how individual teams work is really a sub-optimization and creates sometimes as many problems as it solves. So back to the LinkedIn post, 5 questions here, which I'll credit to Steve and Daniel. Scrum is for product teams, Kanban is for service teams. Scrum is for complex work, Kanban is for simple work. Our Scrum team has evolved to become a Kanban team. We do Scrum Bank, we do Kanban because we can't plan out for an entire sprint. Scrum is revolutionary, Kanban is evolutionary. Some interesting, definitely provocative statements there, and I'm going to treat them in 3 groups. The first 2 are quite closely related, and I would describe them as quite clever trolls. They are, well, I'll explain these in detail in a moment, but there are some, there's a grain of, like all good trolls, there's a grain of truth in it that makes you wonder that it might be true. But the grain of truth isn't the one that you think it is. There's a very clever misdirection at work in both of these. The second group, I think these are actually based more on misunderstandings of Scrum, or people's failure to implement Scrum well, or even to understand what Scrum is about. So if in the first two I'll be defending Kanban's honour, I'm going to be defending Scrum in that next set of three. I'll leave the last one till last. I think I won't spoil the ending. We'll move straight into those first two. So Scrum is for product teams, Kanban is for service teams. And I'll just, my gut reaction, this is straight from the blog post, yuck, or propaganda at best based on an error of logic, more bluntly a lie based on a misdirection. So what's this misdirection that I'm talking about? Let's look at a definition of Scrum, or at least a description of what Scrum is or what it's all about. And this is straight from the horse's mouth. This is from scrum.org, from their What is Scrum page, or a slightly older version of the What is Scrum page. This was the version that existed at the time I wrote my blog post. I went back to the web archive, the Wayback Machine, this week to understand when it changed, and it did change this year. So Scrum is a management and control process that cuts through complexity to focus on building products that meets business needs. I think this is actually a great statement. It describes Scrum very well, and it's a great thing to aspire to. So that's Scrum. So what's Kanban? I'm going to use my own description of Kanban. So this is from Kanban from the inside. The Kanban method, the humane, start with what you do now approach to change. Start with what you do now here is in italics because it's a reference to something, and it's a reference to the first foundational principle of Kanban, start with what you do now. Kanban technically is described as an evolutionary approach, or an evolutionary approach to change. That's a technical thing that doesn't resonate with everybody, but the idea that you start with what you do now and change from there or evolve from there is something that most people can get their heads around. It's about moving forward from where you are, not about implementing a pre-existing design. So that's how the two describe themselves, and let's put those together. So Scrum is for product teams. Well, that seems very clear actually from the description on the left. But is there anything in either of these statements that tells you that Kanban is for service teams? Certainly there's nothing here that says Kanban is only for service teams. The Kanban is to start with what you do now method, and if what you do is service, yes, it will work well. If what you do is product, then yes, it will work well. So that's the misdirection. You're supposed to take away from this that Kanban is only for service teams, but actually it has been used very successfully with teams of all kinds. And if you've read David Anderson's original Kanban book, you'll know that the case study for that book was actually a very large project, a multi-million-dollar project. So quite a clever troll based on a misdirection, based on what Scrum isn't aimed at. It's not aimed at service, and to be honest, when it's been used in service, people have found that difficult, and the recommendation has been for people to look at Kanban, which is a good recommendation, but doesn't justify the statement at the top of the screen. One other thing I would mention, I've highlighted meet business needs, or even just meeting needs, and I think that's a fine thing to aspire to. We'll see some more of that in a moment. You saw it in fact in the True North, needs anticipated and met at the right time. Even product teams find that to meet needs well, they're going to end up interacting with real customers, and most of the teams that I work with realize that having real customers is a good thing. Just writing code and never seeing your work actually used in anger isn't actually the most meaningful of activities for many developers. We want our work to count for something. We want it to meet needs, to do something valuable. And those teams very quickly realise that service is very much part of the whole product. Most products live and die not just by the quality of the code that's written, but by the quality of the services around them, and that's something that many product teams take a very active interest in. So what I'm suggesting here is, not a contradiction, but the complementary nature of Scrum and Kanban. Yes, Scrum may be a very well understood way of developing products, but there'll be a service aspect to your work, and some of the ways that Kanban can help you evolve your process can also be very helpful to product teams as well, and we'll show a concrete example of that in a moment. In a very similar vein, Scrum is for complex work, Kanban is for simple work, and as per my reaction, it's really the same trick being employed again. Double just like the last one, but with a dose of appeal to authority thrown in. And appeal to authority is a very bad smell. Some people call it a logical fallacy. It's not necessarily a fallacy. When people resort to appeal to authority, that's usually a sign that the argument is a very weak one. And to explain the appeal to authority, I could go back to that definition of Scrum we saw a minute ago. What I instead do is show you the new version from 2018. Scrum is a framework within which people can address complex adaptive problems while productively and delivering products of the highest possible value. Again, some good stuff in there with some jargon that for me feels a bit clunky actually, but hey, it's not my definition. Complex adaptive problems. What we're saying is that product development work involves products, teams, customers and their respective environments all co-evolving together, creating a complex adaptive system. And this is, that is the nature of product development, and it's why we employ iterative and incremental methods when we deliver now. Very few of us have experienced incremental and iterative delivery, and that are willing and happy to see products evolve, teams evolve, customers evolve, marketplaces evolve, organizations evolve, and so on. Very few of us would want to go back to the bad old days of waterfall projects that took months, if not years, and tended to disappoint everybody at the end of them. So Scrum is for complex work. So Kanban is for simple work, it says the statement. But what is it about the start with what we do now approach to change the simple? It's a quite ridiculous statement. Let's look again at some of the definitions of the methods. To start with what you do now, I mentioned already, is foundational principle number one. The second one is agree to pursue evolutionary change. That sounds very much like the evolving product, team, organization, marketplace, and so on that I described a moment ago in relation to Scrum. Encourage active leadership at all levels. Again, is that something that's going to be you do just by following a linear plan? Can you predict exactly what the results will be of encouraging leadership in your organization? Clearly you can't. This is, again, an evolutionary adaptive process. Implement feedback loops. Start to apply systems thinking in your organization. Start to identify the feedback loops that exist in your organization already. Steer those towards being healthy. Supporting, using, for example, metrics that reflect the values that you want to be reinforced, and being wary of metrics that support older-fashioned values, as an example. Regular reflection, just as we see with Scrum, regular planning, regular delivery, a lot of things that were very familiar to anyone who has a background in Agile. So again, a troll based on a misdirection. More on the complex thing, if you're in the business of change, then it's even very naive to say, oh, this is just complex stuff. This is the appeal to authority. When you start to look at whether it's features, or outcomes as we've got here. So this is the result of an exercise that I like to facilitate where we generate outcomes that we desire for our organizations. And then we use what's called the Kanban 4 points exercise to explore outcomes in relation to each other and in relation to these Kanban concepts of obvious, complicated, complex, and chaos. The fact is not everything belongs in complex. Some things are solved problems that we can either plan through or just we know what needs to be done. Nor do we want to live always in the complex space. It's very wasteful to be experimenting when the problem is a known problem already. Just as it's very wasteful to follow a linear plan where the outcome is very uncertain. Each of us has our natural biases. Some of us like to explore, to iterate, to experiment, and I will say I'm one of those people. But I'm not going to, or I hope that I don't use those inappropriately when other approaches would be more appropriate. Our Scrum team, so those are the two bits of trolling of Kanban. I hope you realise that whilst there might be clever trolls, they're very unfair and disrespectful, I think. The next three, I think, are actually unfair on Scrum, where people's bad perceptions of Scrum, misunderstandings of Scrum, cause them to give up on it prematurely and think their answer may lay elsewhere, where in fact they just need to try a bit harder, apply a bit more discipline, or whatever the solution might be. So let's look at our Scrum team has evolved to become a Kanban team. This might be a positive statement, it might be a negative statement. We'll start with the negative statement first. We stopped doing a bunch of Scrum-related stuff and we really don't know what we're doing. This is quite a common story. People from both the Scrum and Kanban communities rather despair when we hear this. People found Scrum to be a little bit hard. In fact, the Scrum guide warns you that Scrum is hard. It's kind of meant to be hard. It's meant to challenge you. It's meant to challenge you to find out, what's working and not working about your organization, about your product, about your customer, and so on, the way your team works. It's kind of meant to be hard and to challenge you to find better ways of doing things. So stopping Scrum just because it was hard rather misses the point. It might be a positive statement. We're using a whole number of new techniques that are working really well for us. We're really pursuing flow. We're pursuing things like continuous delivery, where we're delivering, not just, once a sprint, but we're delivering, multiple times a week, multiple times a day, even. And that's fine. I would say that continuous delivery and Scrum aren't mutually exclusive. You can do time boxing in terms of what you plan to achieve over a sprint, and still make deliveries during that sprint. I'll go a bit more into how much we plan to a sprint and what our aims for the sprint is in a minute. And I think to understand those properly is essential to understanding what Scrum is really all about. I'll skip over this side and move to the next one. We do Scrum Bank. So I'm going to just mention a couple of resources. So the one on the right is my friend Ajay Reddy's book, The Scrum Bank Revolution. So Scrum Bank goes back to Coriolanus's paper originally, and was a bit under-resourced for quite some time. It's good that people are paying it some attention again. What you see on the left is the cover slide to a talk I did in India a couple of years ago, December 2015, at Lean Kanban India. Those slides are on SlideShare, but I'll take you through just a little picture of how that project looked. What you will see here, this looks like lots of sticky notes and whiteboards, but when you look at it in detail, you will see elements of both Scrum and Kanban here. So what we have on the leftmost picture is a story map for this particular project. The project was find an apprenticeship at the Skills Funding Agency. Now, if you're in the UK, you'll recognise at least one of those names. The Skills Funding Agency is a government agency responsible for skilling, as its name implies, and in particular it's responsible for running the apprenticeships programme in the UK. Now, I worked on that project as the interim delivery manager, working on it for 6 months. And I worked on a similar project, Carers Allowance in the UK, another very well-known project in the UK, one that got very good press as well, and also another Scrum Bank project. So there's plenty of experience in the UK, and especially in the government sector, of Scrum and Kanban being used together in this way. So leftmost board is a story map. Many of you will be familiar with those. So the columns here aren't stages in a workflow or states of work items as they might be in a Kanban system. They are stages in a user journey of the Find an Apprenticeships service. What's less easy to see are the little yellow stickies down the left-hand side, and those are the numbers of sprints. We've taken horizontal slices across this story map to loosely plan out the next few sprints. I say loosely because we know exactly what we want to deliver in the next sprint, but what we're going to deliver in subsequent sprints is always up for negotiation. What's clever and what was a sign of maturity of this team is that they were very disciplined in not overcommitting or for that matter undercommitting into a particular sprint. They always wanted to achieve something meaningful in that sprint, but they weren't going to make the mistake of filling it up with work and actually risking the failure of that sprint. It was a great sight to see when people were trying to move stickies to that top row of the board, they were already reaching out for other stickies to move down to further on. This whole thing of in Kanban terms, I would describe as balance between demand and capacity. That was something very well understood also from a Scrum perspective. Some other features of that left-hand board, you'll notice some of the stickies further down on the board have got little red flags on them, or flags of various colours. And we got very good at something that Kanban teams are very familiar with. I think Scrum teams are learning the techniques as well of being very proactive at identifying and managing our dependencies. We had dependencies with the developers of other systems. And one of the nice stories about this project is that the two teams that initially didn't get on at all well, eventually found very effective ways of working together and sitting together and all these things. That story is for another day. We also had dependencies on people like content designers. Sometimes you would need a legal opinion or a policy opinion from someone from the agency or from the government department, and so on. And we learned not to start what we couldn't finish. We learned to manage our dependencies proactively, and we learned to find some good quality work that we really could deliver each sprint. So that's the left-hand board. The middle board is actually exactly the same work. It's the upstream work we haven't yet started on development, but organised into something that looks like a Kanban board. One of the ironies here is that in some ways the left-hand board is more a Kanban board than the right one, in as much as in the left-hand board we pay close attention to capacity, to how much work we want to commit to in a sprint, and that's not at all visible in the second board. The second board does visualize a process, but it doesn't apply any controls on work in progress. The right-hand board we could have an interesting debate about whether it's a Kanban board. It certainly shows a development process, work starting ready, in progress, to done here. Always quibble over columns called done, but this meant development done, and then an acceptance and testing process. What you won't know from just looking at the screen is that the number of items in progress is a number very much smaller than the number of developers. There's a high degree of collaboration going on. to the extent that explicit numeric limits on work in progress in that column would not have been particularly useful or important. So very strong emphasis on collaboration during the development stages, and also a lot of attention to the later stages, the acceptance and deployment and post-deployment stages as well. So one very actually positive sign, you can see that we've been messing about with the design of the board. You see the dashed red lines there. We wanted to get more control over some of the more problematic parts of the process, more visibility on who the acceptance process with, whether that was with testers, whether that was with the product owner, whether that was with some external stakeholder or whatever. Also, what you won't know from just looking at the board is our intolerance for work that is built but untested, or untested but not deployed. And our attitude was, if it can be out there delivering value to our users and the citizens of the country, then that's where that work should be. So this, in terms of just looking at it, this looks like quite a nice Scrum Bank implementation. Appearances obviously can be deceptive, just having the visualization tools, and trust me, there was just visualization everywhere. Every wall was covered with something. Did it actually work? And I paid some quite close attention to this. I do have some hard numbers. Over a gap of a few weeks, we saw both a modest increase in throughput, so 1.1 stories per day increased by about 10% to 1.2 stories per day, but a dramatic improvement in lead time. So the time it took for us to decide to start something, to have it out in production, it dropped from about 24 days to about 23 days. So that's a reduction of about a third. We later halved that again to about 8 days. So by the end of my time on this project, a much slicker process. Time that we were careful not to start work that we couldn't finish. We managed our dependencies well, as I mentioned already. We also didn't start a piece of work until we knew how it was going to be tested, who was going to test it, in what environment, when it was likely to be deployed, and so on. So that kind of end-to-end understanding of our process was very important. And it didn't stop when we deployed either. One thing that the UK government projects have done very well and put many private sector projects to shame is in the way that they spend time, invest significant time exploring customer needs, user needs at the front end of the process, but also at the end of the process validating that the features that we deliver, the changes that we make, are having the beneficial effects on the users that we predicted at the beginning. So very much a lean startup flavour to the process. So that's we do Scrum Bank. A concrete example, a couple of concrete examples. The next statement about Scrum. We do Kanban because we can't plan for an entire sprint, and I gave this one very short shrift. I find it hard to see this as anything other than a feeble cop-out, I said. I think this statement might be true for service teams, people whose job is to respond to phone calls, to respond to the service requests and so on. I find it a bit harder to sympathise with this in the context of product development. And I think the people who make these kinds of statements just either don't understand how Scrum works, don't understand what I call the Zen No Scrum, which I'll come to in a moment, or don't understand just how much freedom they have to get these things right. So if, for example, you can't plan a month ahead, then plan a fortnight ahead or a week ahead. You can choose not to plan so that you give your plan. You can choose not to plan to your maximum capacity, and you can choose not to give yourself zero wiggle room. This is something that most experienced, even traditional project managers have learnt a long time ago. You never plan without contingency. This is just as true, if not more true, in the Agile world. If you're actively looking for feedback, you should plan in the time to respond to that feedback. And if you're just filling yourself up to your eyeballs with development work, then you're actually denying yourself all the benefits of iteration and incremental delivery. And then there's the simple fact that development work, product development work of all kinds, is highly variable. Very often we're given only a sticky note's worth of information about the piece of work that's needed. We have to explore, find out what needs to be done. We need to understand all the dependencies before that piece of work can be delivered. We might need more than one attempt before we nail it, and so on. So to treat work as something that's entirely predictable is foolhardy. There's nothing in Scrum that denies that. Scrum just asks you to make commitments that you as a team can try to keep. A bit more about that on the next slide. The last bullet I put, this is just again copied from the blog post. The confidence you attach to your plans is up to you. Just because you plan to do something doesn't mean you will do it in exactly the amount of time that you hope. If you think that just because you deliver 10 story points worth of work in the last sprint that you will inevitably deliver 10 story points worth of work in the next, you are setting yourself up for failure. Half the time you're going to be wrong. That may be what some people think Scrum is about. It may be even what some people teach that Scrum is about, but it really does miss the essence of Scrum. I think the essence of Scrum is in the sprint goal. And this is why I have found Scrum to be so powerful in these government digital projects. If you're working in the government space in an area that hasn't seen Agile before, to actually meet a significant goal in the space of a sprint is something amazing. I mean, something really meaningful. And it's at the heart of Scrum, the sprint goal, an objective set for the sprint that can be met through the implementation of work that's found in the backlog. If all you're focused is on working your way through a list of tasks and you take your eye off that goal, you are actually misunderstanding Scrum. And so, my advice to any team that's struggling is to start in their planning, properly identifying what their goals are, what they hope to achieve in ways that would be meaningful, not just to the team, not just to someone looking at the backlog, but that would be meaningful to their customers as well. That makes for a much more predictable process, and it makes for a much more meaningful work and more effective work on behalf of their customers as well. So that was, we do Kanban because we can't plan for an entire sprint. That leaves the last one. Scrum is revolutionary, Scrum is evolutionary. Some truth there, exaggerated for effect, not all that useful. Scrum is revolutionary if you've never done iterative development before, if you've never used a time box before. Kanban is evolutionary in the technical sense that it's a start with what you do now method. But implicit in Kanban is the idea that you're going to visualize your work and limit your work in progress. Two things that some organizations find extremely difficult. They are, in a good way, radical things to do. Just as Scrum is a radical process if all you've known is waterfall. Scrum will cease to be revolutionary when it's completely mainstream. That might happen one day. And the same then would be true of Kanban as well. If we understand that we must keep our work visible, as both frameworks encourage, if we understand that our team, our environments, our process and so on need to evolve, this as a dichotomy becomes less and less effective. So it may be exaggerated for effect. There is a grain of truth in it, but is it a useful way of making a decision, making a judgment as to which you want to use? I think a much more helpful approach is to think on the outcomes that you want. So this is what we do in our agenda shift workshops, for example. We spend some time exploring needs, organizational needs, team needs, individual needs, customer needs, and so on, and then agreement and outcomes. And with agreement and outcomes, the rest just follows. If you know what it is you want to achieve, then find some tools that are going to help you achieve it. And then treat those as options, understand what assumptions you are making if those tools are going to be effective for you, and make sure you've got some mutual accountability. Don't set people up for failure. Make sure that the people who are stepping out, trying things, are going to be supported by their peers and their managers, that we're working together not just on delivery but changing the organisation, and that's something that we do as a joint activity. So this takes me to the last slide. It's just a repeat of the original question. Do I think that combining the Kanban principles and practices with the Scrum framework will enhance the collaboration across your Agile teams? You can draw your own conclusions. You may feel so firmly identified with one camp or the other that you can't imagine that the other one could provide any benefit. I'm not one of those people. I do believe that the two can work well. I do believe that Scrum teams can benefit from using Kanban. I agree that I also believe that where organizations are using Kanban, that there can be some benefit from understanding how Scrum works, implementing Scrum in appropriate places and in appropriate ways, and so on. Given that Scrum is already so well established in product development, I think for most people it will be Kanban, where the what you do now is Scrum, which is Scrum Bank. There'll be other teams that would benefit from thinking a bit more carefully about how they plan, not necessarily firm time boxes in the way that Scrum would recommend, but understanding the rhythms of Scrum and the different ways that you can control your work in progress that aren't just about numbers on columns on boards. That's my own conclusion. I will lead you to make your own. That's the end of the talk part of this, and I'd be very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mike. Great talk and a great sort of expansion on the blog that you did. I think you nicely covered the different points that you covered in the blog. Folks, looking forward to your questions here. Mike, let me start with one of my own initially. Based on what you've been seeing, you said this is like 2012 all over again. But based on what you've seen in the last 6-7 years, what's your sense of how are Agile teams adopting Kanban? That is, in a typical situation, what's sort of the mix of teams that are using just Scrum or Scrum and Kanban combined?
I think it's very mixed. I think there are a lot of people out there who have a very basic working knowledge of what Scrum and Kanban are, haven't been formally trained, haven't been coached in either to any great depth, and you see a mismatch of both. Sometimes which works, sometimes it doesn't. I've walked into some organisations and I've just been blown away by what I see in terms of what's visualised, for example, or the level of collaboration that I see in evidence in those teams and so on. The level of empathy for their customers, that's something also that I look for. But it's a very mixed bag. Agile is now mainstream as a concept. but that doesn't mean that the majority of teams are doing it well. And Kanban is, just a few years behind Agile in that same curve. I think a lot of people understand the value of visualizing work. The idea of keeping your workload under control is increasingly well understood, but it's also a hard thing when you're under pressure from people that don't understand it. So all I can say, a very mixed bag. For those of us who are in the business of helping organizations do these things better, I think we'll be kept busy for a while yet.
Right, absolutely. I had another question, but before that, let me take a couple of audience questions as well. So there is the question, have you seen that teams adapt to self-organization more readily in Kanban as compared to Scrum?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that Scrum or Kanban are the definitive factors in those. I think a lot of it is about leadership behaviours as much as the framework that's used. If you look back to Kanban from the inside, my case study, the culture there was that they looked to the manager. That was me. I was the CTO. They really looked to the manager to decide how things were going to be done. And that was the corporate culture. I suspect also there was an element of national culture in that as well, but I'm not completely certain of that. And it took quite a lot of effort from my side to convince them that actually I'd be delighted if they would come up with the ideas themselves, work out for themselves some of the ways that they wanted to work. And the story I described in the book was we did some retrospectives, and it was really hard for me not to be the one doing all the talking, and they were looking for me to give my opinion on everything, to come up with a design for everything. And it was very obvious that it wasn't working. And I said, well, the next time you do a retrospective, do it when I'm out of the country. So I was commuting backwards and forwards at the time. And they came up with, they actually agreed things that I never would have dared suggest. They all but mandated pair programming, for example, something that I was very interested in them trying, but would certainly never have thought of mandating. I go back to my time as I was a global development manager at UBS, and my first day in that job, I had a queue of people coming up to my desk asking me what piece of work should I do next, which seemed extraordinary to me. And clearly my predecessor had a very different management style to mine. I'm very seriously committed to self-organisation, have been for many years. But there are clearly other people with some very different management styles who think it's their business to organise everybody else. And so I think that's actually more important than the framework. It's a cultural thing, and it's one in which the example set by leadership is very important.
Right, absolutely. I think in so many different cultures, it is really the management that sets the tone, and probably applies everywhere. And I completely agree with that. There's another question about classes of service. So, what do you think about combining Scrum with classes of service and or types of services from Kanban?
Yes. Well, I suppose the best thing is if I explain what we did on those Scrum Bank projects. The trick when you've got anything that you want to be managed differently to anything else is to make sure that that's visible in some way. So we used different coloured flags to indicate different kinds of dependencies. Dependencies between teams, dependencies on different kinds of external stakeholder, for example. And we used visualization to indicate pieces of work that need to be got through the system quickly for whatever reason. So we could use a swim lane for that, or different coloured stickies. And it's the sort of thing that just varies from team to team, and it depends on how complicated the design of your board is already. A lot of people like the idea of a swim lane for fast work, the expedite lane as it's often called, and that's an idea popularised by the Get Kanban simulation game. But it's by no means the only way of doing it, and just different colours can be appropriate as well. If I go back, is my screen still visible?
Yeah.
If I go back to these pictures here, you'll notice on the right hand board there's some pink stickies. So those pink ones were defects or other issues being experienced in test or production. And again, going back, years and years to my UBS days, I've always wanted, encourage teams to treat test and production as high priorities relevant to their development work. Our job is, our goal is systems that work, not to write more code. So we use the different colours to indicate that.
So it should be fairly straightforward to use at least one or two. The expedited, for example, is a straightforward case, and as well.
Yeah, and whether using sticky notes or an electronic tool, I mean, all electronic tools will give you that facility.
Right.
Well, except for Trello. Trello doesn't give you swim lanes, so not Trello.
Yeah, certainly Swift Kanban would give you a lot of support there. So one question from my side, which is, what's been typically the nature of the situation when a Scrum team starts to think, should we be trying Kanban? Should we also be looking at Kanban? Where are they in their overall maturity or in their, let's say, ability to deliver quality software that they start to look at something like this? And in general, I guess it's a sort of guideline for Scrum team. Should they be looking at Kanban or when should they be looking at Kanban?
Yes, I think quite often the time comes when teams realise that to get the most out of the system, they've got to manage competing pressures. So that's competition between different projects, competition between development and production, and so on. On the middle board here, you can see 3 swim lanes. So that's 2 separate projects plus all the things we'd like to improve in the background. So that's already 3 sets of competing priorities. And behind those different categories, there are different stakeholders as well with different with different priorities as well. So I think that's one. And when you've got competition between the work that you want to deliver sprint by sprint, goal by goal, and stuff that's delivered over very different timeframes to that. So there's the emergency work that we've already talked about. But there's also things that you need to manage over a period of weeks. When you're doing lean startup type work, some of your experiments take several weeks to test. Before you get enough data, for example, and it's not necessarily tied to your process of hypothesis and then insight gathering and testing and so on. That cycle isn't necessarily that well tied to your sprints, and so you start to visualize that independently, manage that independently. That's something I've described in both books actually, is the idea of Kanban inside Scrum and Kanban outside of Scrum, and it's important to understand the difference. Do you see Kanban just as a way of managing tasks? And that's, to me, actually quite a disappointing way of applying Kanban. I'm not very interested in tasks. I'm interested in the end in customer outcomes. Those quite often need to be managed over long periods. So Scrum becomes the vehicle for delivering the product development work within a broader framework for managing change over a period of time. And everything I've just said there applies to organizational changes, product development, which is the space I spend most of my time in now.
Right. Okay, great. Well, sort of a follow-up question to that, and probably the last one. We are sort of over time here. What today, if you were to look at teams that you see working or you come in contact with, roughly what percentage of Scrum teams are also already using Kanban?
I'm not sure I can give a very reliable answer to that question. People know my background. I'm likely to be approached by people who are using Kanban already or very. That's becoming less and less true. Agenda Shift isn't a Kanban product, but I'm still associated with the book. It's a nice problem to have. I'm not complaining. It does makes my data very suspect.
Absolutely. Okay, understood. All right, folks. I'm going to wrap it up here. We are way over time. Unfortunately, there was a confusion about the start time in the initial announcement that we did about the webinar, and then the follow-up emails that we sent to everybody. I think most of you did look at it as a start time of 7 a.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. UK, 4 p.m. Central European time, and I think all of you did join in early, so thank you for that, and my apologies for the confusion. Mike, my apology to you as well, because you had no warning of that. Just wanted to make sure to let everyone know that the slides and the recording for the webinar will be made available to everyone. So those of you who asked that question, yes, we will follow up in a day or two at the most and send you the links to both of those artifacts. Mike, thank you so much for doing this webinar. It's like I said, it's a very popular subject. As I attend conferences, especially in the US, especially Agile conferences, I see a lot more discussion on Scrum and Kanban. A lot of the Scrum versus Kanban types of discussion, which I've been trying to sort of bridge that gap. And your blog was very timely, and I think it's a great start to our webinar series for this year to do this webinar with you. Thank you so much.
That's my pleasure, and thank you.
Great. Thank you all for attending the webinar today. And we will be back with another one in the next month. And till then, stay tuned and stay in touch. If you have any questions for us, do drop us a line either at Digite or to Mike at Agenda Shift. Thanks a lot. Take care.